Throughout history, there have been countless lies, schemes, and hoaxes that have captivated the public imagination and caused chaos. Some of these hoaxes were carefully crafted and executed for years, while others were simply a product of the times in which they occurred. Here are some of the most prolific examples of deception in human history. In 1998, former President Bill Clinton emphatically denied having sexual relations with Monica Lewinsky. But this denial was soon put to rest when his DNA was found on a stain on the intern's dress. This moment of truth became known as his comeuppance and remains a controversial moment in history. After all, how could the leader of the free world be implicated in such a scandal? Ultimately, this episode serves as a reminder that no one is ever above the law, no matter how powerful they may be. In 1912, amateur archaeologist Charles Dawson and a geologist from the British Natural History Museum made a startling announcement: the discovery of the remains of a missing link between ape and man. Little did they know that the skull fragments and jawbone found near Piltdown, England, were part of a carefully crafted hoax. The bones were stained to look old, and the teeth, which likely came from an orangutan or chimpanzee, were filed down to appear human. This elaborate ruse fooled the scientific community for decades, highlighting the importance of critical thinking and skepticism in the scientific process. Lance Armstrong was once a hero to many, a cancer survivor, and an American road racing cyclist who had won the Tour de France multiple times. For years, he denied any involvement in doping, but in 2013, he finally confessed to it. This shocking admission would strip him of all his achievements from August 1998 and his incredible 7 Tour de France titles. It was a scandal that shook the cycling world and tarnished the reputation of one of the greatest athletes of his time. In 1941, Alan Turing, a British mathematician, astounded the world with his success in cracking the Nazi Enigma code. This code had been used to coordinate German U-boat attacks on the Allied fleet in the North Atlantic. To protect the Allies, Ultra, a top-secret Allied intelligence project, was set up to feed the unsuspecting Nazis disinformation. As a result, the enemy forces were kept off their trail, allowing the Allies to remain one step ahead of them. Thanks to Alan Turing's genius, the Allies were able to gain the upper hand in the war. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 was a harrowing experience for the world, as two of the greatest superpowers of the time were on the brink of nuclear war. The Soviet Union had been sending defensive weapons to Cuba, but the U.S. had suspicions that other missiles were being supplied, and President Kennedy was convinced that Nikita Khrushchev had ulterior motives. Thankfully, through careful negotiations, the crisis was averted and a nuclear war was prevented. The world breathed a collective sigh of relief. In 1938, Orson Welles put on the most shocking performance of the century. Directing and narrating an episode of the Mercury Theatre on the Air, Welles presented an adaptation of H.G. Wells' novel, The War of the Worlds, as a series of live news bulletins. The alarming news updates were so realistic that people across the U.S. were sent into a state of panic, believing Martians had indeed invaded Earth. It was one of the most sensational hoaxes of its time. Titus Oates was an Anglican who caused a stir in 1678 when he fabricated a Catholic conspiracy to assassinate King Charles II. His wild claims resulted in a wave of anti-Catholic sentiment in the country. When Charles's successor, King James, heard of this, he had Oates tried and convicted of perjury. However, his story didn't end there. William III eventually pardoned Oates and even granted him a pension. This peculiar tale of a man who went from incarceration to comfort is sure to leave you in shock. Once upon a time, two young cousins, Elsie Wright and Francis Griffiths, managed to pull off an extraordinary hoax, fooling none other than the great writer Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. In 1917, the mischievous pair faked a series of photographs that appeared to show them meeting mythical fairies at Cottingley in northern England. It wasn't until the 1980s that Elsie and Francis admitted the fairies were actually cardboard cutouts copied from a children's book. It just goes to show even Sherlock Holmes' creator can be taken in by a fairy tale. The Hitler Diaries hoax was one of the most notorious scandals to shock German journalism after 1945. On April 25, 1983, Stern magazine made a sensational announcement of their reporter discovering a series of 60 volumes of purported journals written by Adolf Hitler. However, soon it was revealed that the diaries were nothing but a fraudulent work of Konrad Kujau, a forger who was eventually caught and sent to prison. The aftermath of the hoax brought about several newspaper editors losing their jobs. Phineas Taylor Barnum, the famous American showman, was renowned for his ability to exploit the public's eagerness for the extraordinary. In 1835, Barnum introduced Joyce Haight as George Washington's 161-year-old nursemaid, only to be exposed after her death as being only 80 years old. Barnum's greatest hoax arguably came in 1842 when he unveiled the Fiji mermaid, a creature that boasted a monkey's body and a fish's tail. The Fiji mermaid became one of Barnum's most celebrated spectacles. Han van Meegeren was a master of deception. Born in 1889, the Dutch painter is widely regarded as one of the most ingenious art forgers of the 20th century. He managed to fool some of the most skilled art critics and historians of his time with his meticulously crafted forgeries of some of the world's most renowned artists, including Pieter de Hooch and Johannes Vermeer. His mastery of the craft, which he developed over the years, enabled him to pull off impressive scams and become one of the most talked about art forgers in history. U.S. President Richard Nixon uttered one of the most memorable lines in American political history, "I am not a crook." While speaking on national television, Nixon vehemently denied any involvement in the June 1972 Watergate break-in, and proclaimed that there can be no whitewash at the White House. Despite his protests, Nixon resigned from office just over a year later, on August 9, 1974. His resignation made him the first ever U.S. president to do so, cementing his name in history. Adolf Hitler and his Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, used terror, coercion, and mass manipulation to launch a nationwide campaign that convinced the German people that Jews were the enemy. Through this powerful propaganda, which was devastatingly effective, Hitler was able to spread anti-Semitism across the country. This ultimately led to the implementation of a national policy called the Final Solution, a policy of genocide and ethnic cleansing of the Jewish people. The power of propaganda was so great that it enabled the Nazis to carry out their inhumane hatred and violence. The Profumo affair of 1963 rocked British politics, as Secretary of State for War John Profumo was forced to admit his sexual relationship with Christine Keeler, a would-be model. Adding to the scandal was Keeler's involvement with Captain Yevgeny Ivanov, a Soviet naval attaché. Profumo was forced to leave his government and parliamentary posts in shame, and the scandal continued to haunt the political landscape for years to come. It remains one of the most well-known and salacious stories of British politics. In 1998, Andrew Wakefield, a British physician, published an article in the respected medical journal Lancet that linked autism to the MMR vaccine. Despite its incredibly small sample size and ethical issues, the study received wide publicity and triggered a decrease in childhood vaccination rates. In the years that followed, thousands of preventable cases of measles occurred in the UK, as well as a resurgence of the disease in the US. Wakefield's controversial paper ultimately cost many people their health and cost Wakefield his medical license. For decades, the cigarette industry lied to consumers, claiming that their product was not addictive and did not pose any health risks. However, the truth is that cigarettes are just as addictive as cocaine and opioids and can have majorly detrimental effects on the body, leading to cancer, emphysema, heart disease, and more. As recently as 1998, The four largest tobacco companies agreed to pay $206 billion to help with the medical expenses of illnesses caused by their pernicious products. It's time to realize the deadly truth behind cigarettes.